Hey guys, so this video will be a review of Period 4. Period 4 is, of course, the onset of World War I and kind of the lead up to it to the present. So ostensibly 1914 to the present, but really more or less 1900 to the present, because we'll talk about stuff before then. So obviously we'll talk about causes of World War I, some of the events of it. I'm not really going to go into depth with that. You certainly don't need to know that for this course, and honestly, it's just not as consequential as like what are the factors that lead to it, and what are the enormously catastrophic effects of World War I. We'll look at the Russian Revolution a little bit. Then, of course, the interwar years, which is generally known as the Age of Anxiety, which is an appropriate term for the really, really difficult situation that a lot of Europe finds itself in. Then, of course, World War II, the Cold War, and European unification post-Cold War. It is a little bit about, say, like internal developments in Western Europe, but also really like more the modern issues as well that we've talked about. All right. So World War I, I've described it as this before, and it is a very common acronym to use to describe it. And a very appropriate one is that the main causes, MAIN, spell out militarism, alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. So militarism, the idea here is that the buildup of weapons, the arms race, as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution, of very, very modern armaments, many of which are deeply defensive in nature. So the machine gun, barbed wire, and massive scale ships. A lot of these are being built up, particularly between England and Germany. And it's not a reason why World War I happens, because they have a lot of armaments, but certainly it helps to extend the death toll and the catastrophic nature of the war. In addition, the militarism isn't just building up your military. It's an emphasis on the military as a quintessential part of your identity. That militarism, it's an ism. It's a belief in the importance of the military. And so people were more apt and likely to use it, which is really catastrophic, of course, in World War I. A is the alliance system. So the idea here is, of course, that, the alliance system was meant really it was Otto von Bismarck trying to isolate France, but ultimately the goals of alliances were for peace. The idea that no one was going to declare war on a defensive alliance, because then they'd be subject to a massive scale retaliation. Most alliances are defensive; they're not offensive in nature. So if you just invade somebody, normally your allies won't join you. This happened many times in the history of the world. So we really have two alliance systems that developed: the Triple Entente, made up of Britain, France, and Russia, and then the Triple Alliance of Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. Although Italy will not end up actually honoring their agreement, and they will, a year after the start of the war, actually join in on the side of the Triple Entente. Ultimately, what the alliance system does is it allows for a very, very small event, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of a human life, but of one person being shot, snowballs into this enormously consequential event where we have most of Europe at war, and the most catastrophic war in human history to that point. Imperialism, Germany and Italy are now looking at trying to form colonies. There are all sorts of crises in Africa in particular. Basically, you have now another source of tension between European states, all those borders in Africa, and the economic ramifications for whatever happens in Africa or in Asia. And so certainly it also extends the theater of the war beyond just Europe, which is why we call it a world war. And of course, nationalism plays a role. We have the crises in the Balkan states, particularly with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There is more room for nationalist movements looking for individual statehood. For example, the group that shot Franz Ferdinand, Gavrilo Princip, represented the Black Hand, was a Serbian nationalist group. The idea of pan-Slavism was really in the front of their minds, and it helped to inspire a great deal of unrest more broadly. Now, I'm not going to go over all this stuff in World War I. This is here so that when you check on Classroom, it's available to you. But basically understand that the war becomes extremely defensive in nature. On the Western Front, we basically have trench warfare and a stalemate. That there is an enormous amount of human life lost in a very short period of time, and very little is gained. Certain aggressive movements move the line of the battle, the line between, say, France and Germany a couple miles and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. There are lots of industrial technologies at play here, from poison gas to submarines. Obviously, those aren't on the war front, they're in the water. This is what I'm here for, really important information. Large artillery, machine guns, these sorts of things are extremely, extremely deadly, obviously. And the war becomes a stalemate very, very quickly. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas. That started in July. It wasn't over for over 4 years. In the Eastern Front, it's a lot more complicated. It's much more mobile, mostly because Russia doesn't have the technology to make it a stalemate. They have a lot of people to throw out there, but that's really it. And because of the massive scale loss of Russian troops, and Russia suffers more than anyone else in both world wars in terms of the loss of human beings, even though they pull out of the war early. We're going to look at the Russian Revolution, but basically Russia has a revolution in 1917 where there's a civil war essentially within the state, a deposing of the monarchy, the Romanov dynasty that had been in control for 300 plus years, and ultimately creates the USSR, and then they sign an agreement with an agreement with Germany separately before the end of the war, which is a horrifically bad treaty for Russia, but fortunately for them, they don't have to fulfill the obligations because Germany ends up losing and having the terms of the Treaty of Versailles dictated to them later on. Also on the Eastern Front, Southeastern Front, I guess, the Ottoman Empire, in the midst of all of this, is committing a massive scale Armenian genocide, where actually the United States, just like a couple weeks ago, I believe, President Biden just acknowledged the Armenian genocide, fortunately, for the first time, where 1.5 million Armenians are killed by Turks in the middle of the war. And they pretended it's part of an internal civil war, but really they walked into towns and decimated towns. And so this industrial capability applied to war, industrial capability applied to the eradication of a group of people, is not new when we get to it in World War II. It is, though, more extensive in World War II and, for example, the Holocaust. Things to note about World War I. There is the usage of total war. So this is really World War I and World War II, and it's really important to recognize that total war is this idea of focusing all the resources of a state on the war effort, from communications and transportation to the commercial and industrial capabilities of a nation. So you convert like factories that were making car parts into making airplane parts, for example. This is the total war, that everyone is involved, that you feel like, at home you skip a meal because that food could go somewhere else, to a soldier, to someone who needs it. Everyone felt deeply and part of the war effort. There you see on the slide here a propaganda poster, there are any number of those, asking you to sacrifice something. And so people felt much more part of the war than, for example, you might today, in a war that you may just feel very, very disassociated with. Like, for example, the wars that the United States has fought for the last 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. You're probably not thinking when you eat a meal, almost certainly not thinking when you eat a meal, that could be going to one of them and to support a war effort. That's the difference between total war and a war of like a warrior class almost. It's a very different entity here. There are many consequences of World War I. In fact, it might be one of the most consequential events in the history of the world. It is a turning point in many, many ways. It is the end of 4 empires. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire all stop being entities that have been around for a long, long time. Most of them, not Germany. Russia has the Russian Revolution, which we'll talk about because the first really communist state in the world. There are obviously a number of people who die. A big social change is that women, in large part in the Western world, get the right to vote. As a result of the fact that women are part of the war effort and then largely go into the factories, but don't remain really in factories in large numbers after the war. In fact, in many places, it's less than it was before the war. Because of that and the general tide, women generally get the right to vote, certainly in the United States and in England and Germany, in many of the more progressive states in Western Europe and the Western world more broadly. It has enormous economic costs. The world it's going to be a very difficult time period, especially when 10 years after the war, we'll see the Great Depression. And then, of course, the horrific nature of the 30s and the rise of totalitarian governments, and we'll reference that. Territorial changes are really basically the creation of a bunch of new nation states. The map between the beginning of World War I and the end of and the map after the Treaty of Versailles, really, really consequential. The Treaty of Versailles is one of these very important documents to really understand. So it's the peace settlement for the end of the war. Basically, it creates a League of Nations, which is a failure. The United States doesn't join. Germany will leave when Hitler comes to power. And so many major states aren't part of it. Basically, Germany has terms dictated to it because they are in a difficult position. They are required to pay enormous sums of reparations that are frankly unpayable. And they can't build up their military or navy. They have to give up a great deal of their industrial land to France. And most importantly, probably in the minds of Germans, was this Article 231, the idea of a war guilt clause, where Germany had to accept total guilt for a war that they were obviously not the only party that should have accepted guilt. World War II certainly can blame entirely on the Nazis, and enormously that is their fault. World War I, it's a really complicated endeavor with lots of different causes and developments. Just blaming it all on Germany, probably as a result of the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm II was a doofus, and France was dictating terms because they were terrified of a rebuilt and capable German state, was a really consequential and bad decision. So, again, this is here so that when you look at the slides on Classroom, you have something more to see. But the Russian Revolution really represents the weakening authority of the monarchy in Russia. Not that they're loosening restrictions on anything, but that there are so many economic stresses that they're not industrialized enough to deal with the rest of the world. There's some evidence of this, like the defeat against the Japanese in 1905 in a war. And essentially, in the middle of World War I, while Russia is certainly losing an enormous amount, the Bolsheviks take over in a complicated civil war, promising peace, land, and bread. Things that the monarch was not providing. Ultimately, Nicholas II and his family is carried off into Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, and then all of them are murdered. And we have this civil war for power, ultimately taken by the Bolsheviks, which was actually a smallish group, but they're able to assume control of major cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then Lenin is able to establish, after the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, in which they formally withdraw from World War I, Lenin is able to employ war communism, which was the idea of the nationalization of resources, collectivization of farming, redistribution of land, controlling industry. Although he also makes some exceptions, like eventually when that isn't perfect, he employs the new economic policy, which is essentially a way for if, for example, you have excess goods on your farm, you are able to sell them on a market. It's not capitalism, right? But it is a little concession toward that. And that is, that's Lenin, right? He is a devout intellectual Marxist, but he is not the monster Joseph Stalin ends up being, for example. Okay. The age of anxiety is the term that we use for the 20s and 30s very often, known as the lost generation in certain countries. We see artistic movements that are anti-rational, Cubists, Dadaists. People turn to existentialism, which is a discussion about what is the purpose of life, what is the value of human existence, and all sorts of writers, Sartre and Camus or Orwell, Kierkegaard are challenging those identities. The rise of mass media like film and radio really comes about at this time, when a lot of people have access to a radio in the 1920s, and then films, first silent and then talking. There is a new entertainment and information age, but with it also comes the ability for increased propaganda. I'm not sure, I know we're living in an era now where we can see that purely accessed information is not uniformly good, because it's difficult to discern what is information and what is not misinformation, right? Disinformation campaigns. And that is nothing new. It has its basis here in this era. In 1929, the stock market in the United States collapses. And in addition to the fact that Europe had not really totally recovered from World War I yet, and was probably going to be a while, we have Great Depression that hits not just the U.S., but Europe maybe as significantly, and then more long-term, actually, than in the United States, probably. That might be debatable. Anyway, nations deal with this in different ways, but generally they turn to totalitarian leaders who are going to advocate for protectionist policies, like trade tariffs and barriers, and the results of the Great Depression, the unemployment and the political crises, leads to people turning towards nationalism and fascist movements around Europe. In fact, in Central and Eastern Europe, the only state that's not going to turn to a right-wing or left-wing dictator is Czechoslovakia. And so while Britain is able to sustain and France is able to deal with this, other states that are less economically developed, and Germany, which was dealing with the particularly terrible conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, are unable to respond without turning toward strongmen. So the authoritarian model here is what you would expect. They use all sorts of tools, censorship and indoctrination. There is a secret police, whether it be in Germany under the SS or the KGB or wherever it might be. But in the interwar years, we see these elements develop. And it takes really two forms. Communism, which was about the elimination of private property and collectivization, the removal of social class systems. And this is really popular in Russia, but not so much. They actually are more the boogeyman in the rest of Europe. Whereas fascism, this hyper-nationalist far-right state that was very much about military and nationalistic control, the idea of a military state as the guiding principle for an organization. It allowed for private property and individual ownership, and in that way it differs from communism for sure. But it's definitely about, emphasis on the military, emphasis on jingoism and, anti-minority status, whether in Germany they turn against, for example, Jews and Roma people and homosexuals and the disabled, and that's a common theme really among fascists in Italy or in Germany or in Hungary and in other states as well. And these all come up, obviously. Good examples would be Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy, although there's also Francisco Franco, who is debatably a fascist, but certainly a far-right dictator in Spain as well. And I forgot that this was here, but yes, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, right? They will use those sorts of tools that we talked about. Certainly Mussolini is the first one. He creates the fascist party, and from there Hitler models his organization around him, although he quickly surpasses him in terms of the German state far exceeds the capabilities of the Italian state when he takes over. Hitler will basically use communists and Jews as scapegoats for the war, the Peace of Versailles and how it has really impacted Germany in a negative way. And it really is the Great Depression that allows this to happen. Before the Depression, Hitler's Nazi Party was getting like 2% of the national vote. After the Great Depression, they become the majority party, or plurality party in the German Reichstag. And then through this, the idea is they're going to recover economically through building up their military, ignoring the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, and no one's going to do anything about it because, frankly, they saw like the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles as ridiculous. Except for France, they saw them as ridiculous, and so no one really batted an eye when he said, "I'm going to have a Luftwaffe, an air force." Okay, that makes sense. It's a large state, have an air force, and it isn't until it's way too late that people start to address real problems like, the Nuremberg laws against many of the restricting Jews and doing any number of other features before we get to, of course, the absolute horrors of World War II. In the interwar years as well, Lenin dies young. How young, I don't recall. I think he was about 50. Basically has a series of strokes, and so the state that he was going to develop, the more Marxist internationalist communist state focused on the rise of communism more generally, that goes by the wayside when Joseph Stalin takes over. Joseph Stalin is basically going to advocate for socialism in one country. He does not care about the Marxist model. He is not an intellectual. He is a strongman. I mean, he literally names himself Stalin, which is essentially the Russian ending for steel. So he's like calling himself essentially the man of steel. His real name is Joseph Dukashvili. He's a Georgian. He's not even Russian, but he uses Russian nationalism. And he is going to advocate for these 5-year plans of rapid collectivization and industrialization. It's going to lead to horrific events like the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions of people die in what is essentially a planned genocide because of the Ukraine, while many people are dying of a famine, is a net exporter of a lot of the agricultural goods that it produces. And his rapid industrialization campaign is to build up the Soviet industry that has been lagging behind for a very long time. In class, I know that I had us read a speech to industrial workers where he tried to depict, the history of Russia as a history of being abused by outside forces. And so it is very much the us versus them. We need to industrialize. We need to catch up. Stalin also has these great purges where he gets rid of anyone who challenges his authority, sends them to labor camps or has them killed. That includes like important leaders in the Bolsheviks at the origin, like Leon Trotsky, who ultimately moves to Mexico and is killed with an ice pick in 1940 on Stalin's orders. Okay, there's a whole timeline here for 2 slides of aggression and appeasement in the lead up to World War II. But here is the basic message. Great Depression hits in 1929, 1930. We see the rise of people like Adolf Hitler, who are going to use Jews and communists as scapegoats, start to have more and more anti-Semitic laws, and really flout the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, go back into the Saarland, build up a military, start to eat at some of the areas around Germany, and we'll talk about that in a second. Italy also tries to aggressively do things. Mussolini invades Ethiopia, a place that Italy had been defeated by in the 1890s. Ultimately, in 1936, one of the important developments here is that there's a testing ground for war machines of dictators like Hitler and Mussolini will be found in the Spanish Civil War, where we have the Republicans and the Nationalists, and they will fight one another, and Mussolini and Hitler will support Francisco Franco's efforts here, and they're able to see what some of these new tools of war are able to do. Because while we said that World War I was essentially the Industrial Revolution thrown at war, there is a massive change between the technology in World War I and World War II. Tanks, the usage of airplanes to an enormous degree instead of a very minor reconnaissance degree in World War I, and so on and so forth. In addition, Germany starts to expand, right? Hitler had talked about this thing called Lebensraum, living space. Basically, he advocated for the extension of the German borders, and most specifically the unification of German-speaking peoples. So, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, he engages in an Anschluss where he invades Austria and has them essentially join Germany, although there's a plebiscite and agreed to. I don't know how accurate that really is. Western powers will engage in this policy of appeasement. The idea is if we give Hitler a little bit of stuff, we won't have to fight another war. There's a whole Munich conference in 1938 because Hitler wants the Sudetenland, which is a little ring-shaped area on the edge of Czechoslovakia at the time, bordering Germany. And Neville Chamberlain flies to meet with Hitler and says, okay, we'll give you this, but no more. And of course they wouldn't know. I mean, Neville Chamberlain comes back, he holds a piece of paper and says, we'll have peace in our time. I've signed this agreement with Herr Hitler and things are going to be good. We're going to not fight another war. And it's really easy to demean appeasement, right? Because obviously it results in World War II. But to see like the logic there, you can understand why British people, 20 years removed from the worst war anyone has ever seen, are really hesitant to try and fight another war over a small bit of territory in Czechoslovakia, right? You wouldn't expect them to want to do that. In 1939, Germany will sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin, which he will hold for 2 years until he just invades Russia because he feels like it, when it's no longer beneficial for him not to. And on September 1st, 1939, Germany will invade Poland, starting World War II. So World War II is very different from World War I, right? In the Western Front, Germany knocks out France in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And that's the Blitzkrieg War, the shock and awe campaign. Everyone files in and they just destroy France. So there is no Western Front. From the middle of 1940, when France surrenders, the northern France will become occupied France, and southern France will be Vichy France, which is a Nazi puppet state, essentially. Germany will try and bomb Britain into submission in the Battle of Britain, but they will fail. It's a really important turning point. I mean, if Britain fell, no one would be left fighting the Germans in 1940. Nobody. I mean, the Soviets weren't in the war yet. Britain was it by themselves. There's a very famous speech with Churchill saying, we will fight if necessary for years, if necessary alone. It is a very dark hour, but I don't mean to jump on. There's a movie called The Darkest Hour, but it is maybe their finest one as well. Another quote from Churchill. Anyway, Germany eventually invades the USSR. The US gets involved in the war, although not really in Europe. So for our purposes, not as important. There is massive scale civilian bombing in this war. In Dresden is the best example in Europe, but there are lots of other cities. Rotterdam, many other cities in Europe were bombed beyond belief. In a way that had never happened before. Like, you couldn't really firebomb a city. Like, that just wasn't possible. On June 6, 1944, the United States, Canada, Britain, and Free France launched the D-Day invasion, land at the beaches in Normandy. Ultimately, over the course of a year, while Germany is falling apart internally, the Allies moved from the west, the Soviets from the east. They meet really at the Elbe River in Germany. And after the Germans surrender 8 days after Hitler killed himself in his bunker, also the war ends in Asia when atomic bombs are used on Japan. There were some conditions here, like looking at like what happened at 2 different meetings leading to the end of World War II. I think it is overly specific to look at the differences between these two necessarily, but I have this here because it is important to recognize that basically the big three of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin came to some conclusions about what the war, Europe should look like after the war was over. And that doesn't come to fruition. This was a few months before the end of the war. And it doesn't help that a few months later when they meet at Potsdam, there's only Stalin left as a leader. I mean, Churchill is there, but he has just found out that he is not going to be he lost the election, and Clement Attlee is replacing him as prime minister. FDR dies in April, so Harry Truman has become president, and Stalin will essentially not honor any of his agreements, and this kind of turn here at the end of the war is really consequential. I'm not sure anything else could have been done to keep Stalin from imposing, Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, but this leads directly to the Cold War. So, contextualizing the Cold War, we see basically Churchill will say an iron curtain has descended across Europe. The idea is that you can't see the other side, that there is going to be a big difference now between Eastern and Western Europe beyond what had ever been before. In the West, they're supporting free elections and self-determination. They want to spread democracy, capitalism, freedom of speech and the press. In the East, we have a bunch of Soviet satellite states. And satellite meaning that they, metaphorically revolve around the Soviet Union. From the Soviet point of view, the democracies have been hostile to them. They had fought enormously in World War II and suffered the brunt of the war for 3 years when no one was fighting on the Western Front. They're also scared of the atomic bomb that has been created in 1945 that Soviets won't have until 1949. And they like the idea of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. And so we will essentially have a fight for the rest of the states, like Turkey and Greece and Austria will be kind of in between. So in the Stalin era, there is the partition of Germany into East and West Germany. The idea was that there would be occupation zones, but that they would be united after the war. That does not come to pass, and Germany won't be united again until 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the Soviet Union is collapsing. The policy of containment becomes the policy of the West. The idea is we don't want any new states to become communist, and more importantly, become communist and under the yoke of the Soviet Union. And so in order to contain that, the Marshall Plan is promoted. So the Marshall Plan was an American aid package that was sent to any state that wanted it in Europe, except for the Soviet Union, but obviously none of the Soviet satellite states take it either because they're not allowed. And it is an effort to rebuild Europe. Now, it certainly plays a role. It is several percent of the national budget. That is quite large, though. I mean, it might seem small to be, so it's only 6% of a budget. It's a lot of money for a whole nation. But those states recover, and it's often considered to be part of the economic miracle. That's the term that is generally used for Western Europe after World War II, because this continent that had just been absolutely destroyed by World War II, like just unbelievably, fundamentally ruined. It is a burned out husk. I mean, the way that Churchill describes it at the end of the war, I don't off the top of my head remember the quote, but it is filled with fear that there would be another war. It was filled with, just absolute anxiety. At the end of World War I, everyone thought things were, positive, and at the end of World War II, everyone thought things were inevitably going to collapse, and there would be another war very soon, probably between the U.S. and the USSR, and thankfully that never happens. So there are a couple of crises in Germany, like the Berlin crisis and airlift, when Stalin just basically says that the West is not allowed to bring goods into West Germany anymore through the railroads, and so they airlift stuff in because West Germany is in the middle of East Germany. West Berlin, in the middle of East Germany, and it provides a flashpoint for the Cold War, but ultimately doesn't result in anything. NATO is formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, essentially a defensive alliance with the nations of Western Europe, many of the nations of Western Europe, the United States and Canada, and then the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet states are formed as well on the other side. Russia forms the bomb in 1949. They fight their first proxy war in Korea. They'll find another one in Vietnam, where basically the idea is both states want to support communist or non-communist forces wherever they are fighting. And this becomes really important. In 1953, Stalin dies. He's in the 70s, he dies, and he is replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is going to engage in a policy of de-Stalinization. He engages in this thing called the Khrushchev thaw, where he is going to focus on providing consumer goods and agriculture that is not as unreasonably organized as Stalin had. He is going to, however, externally get very involved in Poland and Hungary when there are democratic uprisings. He will help put them down. He will send tanks in. It's too specific to worry about the U-2 incident or the Cuban Missile Crisis in any detail, but they are, again, flashpoints in the Cold War. They end up supporting nations like Cuba. There you see a young Fidel Castro with him. Any communist movement around the world. And again, every single country becomes a battle, an ideological battle between the East and the West, between communism and capitalism. The Berlin Wall represents this most specifically in 1961 when that gets put up. And it will be up until 1989. He dies and Brezhnev takes over, man of the horrific eyebrow. And he is sort of engaging in a policy of re-Stalinization. An arms buildup, but frankly, not as tense a situation with the West. We don't have an event like the Cuban Missile Crisis that's available at that time. And kind of gets along with Nixon, for example, and some other people. His choices, though, bankrupt the Soviet Union. They are having a lot of difficulty continuing to exist. They continue to support an enormous military, but are not able to provide basic goods for many of their citizens, and it is a problem. He just makes the decision to invade Afghanistan and be part of help support a communist movement there. Afghanistan is often seen as like Russia's Vietnam, that it is this stalemate war that is a lot of invested in, and no one really understood the real point of it, and it was a disaster. Really, it was a misunderstanding of the environment and the circumstances there. And the U.S. supported the other group, the Mujahideen, who partly is led by Osama bin Laden. Interestingly, we supported that group for a while. Did not know, of course, what Osama bin Laden would be or who he really was. Also in his time, we have the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1980. It is the first workers' strike in any of the Soviet states that is at all successful. And we're starting to see with the Solidarity in Poland in 1980, the first real crack in the Soviet Union. It's not in the Soviet Union, it's in a satellite state, but it's a popular movement, and it's able to be put down in a couple years, but they're not able to fundamentally put down the Polish people. And the existence of a Polish pope at the time, Pope John Paul II, as well as a very popular dock worker named Lech Walesa, who will eventually become the president of Poland in the 1990s. All of this is difficult for the Soviet Union long term and is more a sign of things to come. The Cold War ends under Mikhail Gorbachev because Mikhail Gorbachev allows it to end, frankly. He will make a couple of important choices. He will pull Russia out of Afghanistan. He will be the leader, by the way, starting in 85 or so. There are two other short, Chernenko and Andropov, you don't really need to know. They're only in charge for a short amount of time. And he engages in two major things. Two things you should know. Perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika was this economic restructuring to allow for some elements of a free market, trying to advocate for some consumer goods to be brought in, and some relationship with non-communist states. Glasnost was about political openness, ending some of the repression and freedom, reduction on, allowing a little bit more freedom of the press, freedom of speech. These are not like massive scale changes like they're now the United States all of a sudden or Great Britain, but they are significant. And his goal was not to turn away from communism. His goal was to save communism. He is a communist, and he believed in it. But he also recognized that Russia as it was falling apart. That it simply was eating itself because its model did not work. You can't just not have a functioning modern economy and yet still try and fund the second largest military in the world. It just didn't work. He helps to engage in some denuclearization ideas in the INF and START treaties with the U.S., with the West, and is, it's less tense, for sure, Gorbachev. By 1989, he allows for the revolutions in the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to go about without rolling tanks in there. And that's really the beginning of the end. Because he is saying, I'm not willing to go put down those revolutions. It's over. It won't be until December of 1991 that the Soviet Union will completely fall. Although, again, he is not trying to end the Soviet Union. He is not willing to do some of the things that other leaders were to make it continue. The Soviet Union collapses. It's replaced by the first democratically elected person in basically the history of Russia, in Boris Yeltsin. And then for the last 20 years, it's been dominated by Putin, who is aggressively continuing many of the Russian ideas of being expansionist, centralizing power, and getting rid of anyone who gets in his way. Also, of course, there's a shot from the Gorbachev pizza commercial because it's still the most remarkable thing I've ever seen that the premier of the Soviet Union did a pizza commercial. If there is proof that you need that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, you have it right there. Some isms in this period of time as well to know. Nationalism and terrorism can mean different things. There was a secular era movement in the interwar period, but after World War II, there is a rise in fundamentalism. We also see a terrorist movement in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. There is a push, obviously, for Irish independence after World War I, but also, the Irish Republican Army in the mostly in the 60s and the 70s, at times of troubles, and even into the 1990s. There was a very complicated relationship there with Great Britain, so terrorism comes in all shapes and sizes. And fortunately, that has been way down the last 25 years. Protectionism and nationalism come together in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s when lots of Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and people from the Middle East and South Asia come into Europe to work as guest workers. They do so because of decolonization and because there's a need for more workers. Europe did not have enough young people to fulfill their jobs, so they bring in all these groups, which absolutely helps the economy of Western Europe and Central Europe, but it also leads to lots of anti-foreign nationalist parties, right-wing parties, that are going to advocate, for the end of these policies, even before the European Union gets involved. There's a second wave feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. We already mentioned in the last video. First wave feminism, or maybe this one, no, the last one. First wave feminism was about political equality and suffrage. Second wave feminism is about social and economic equality, which certainly has not entirely been achieved yet. But you read from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Birth control becomes a really big factor, that women have more control over the course of their lives, whether or not they're going to be, pregnant. More access to jobs, education, equal access and opportunity in education is fundamentally important. It is not until after World War II that women get fully involved in the workforce, and it becomes more expected for a woman to be part of the workforce. And frankly, even in the years immediately after World War II, it still isn't like the expectation. It takes a long time. I kind of mentioned existentialism in the interwar period. It comes up again in the post-war period of World War II. The idea of trying to make purpose in a purposeless world, from their perspective, is the fundamental problem of being a human. And this is this modern look that, we are responsible for everything on Earth. The what is it, Sartre, Camus, the hell is other people mentality. Consumerism, we see a massive rise of the middle class because of increasing real wages. Particularly, this is Western Europe, not really Eastern Europe as much. Lots of goods, like you're able to buy so much stuff. Cars, TVs, machines, stereos. There's also environmentalist movements, green parties, mostly in the 1970s through the 1990s and into today. Worried about things like global warming and the possibility of nuclear power being a problem, pollution. They advocate for all sorts of things, including social justice elements, like, it takes a long time in some parts of Europe for people to be able to have abortions or for gay people to get married. It's very modern, and in some states, still not the case. One of the most important internal developments in Western Europe after the war is the beginning of the welfare state. Basically, the idea is that the state would essentially be made up of three components: that they would provide social services, financial services, and other non-cash benefits like medicine to its people. So, like nationalized healthcare, like we see in almost all, maybe all of Western Europe. Pensions for old people, supporting children, strong unemployment benefits. The idea is that they're trying to remove class barriers, give more people opportunities for education, and in general provide for the health of the more vulnerable in society. And this is really popular for a very long time, although there are challenges to it. Particularly, there's an example here, Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s in Great Britain cuts a lot of these programs because she and her party deemed them to be too expensive. And this continues to be a flashpoint for right-wing groups in Europe, although nationalized healthcare and many of the things that, for example, don't even exist in the United States are not realistically going to go away. In Western Europe, they are quite expected at this point. The welfare state has done a lot to provide for underserved people. In the last 30 years, we've seen an enormous increase in European unification. So the stages of unification took a long time, but essentially by 1993, we see the development of the European Union. This is a customs union, meaning no one pays tariffs in between areas. There's also the Schengen area, which provides for freedom of movement, which is actually more extensive even than the European Union. The idea here is that when they all work together, they are a more powerful negotiating bloc, which they definitely are, that they have the economy essentially of the United States in terms of size, and that's how they make agreements with outside states like the US or like China or Russia. And ultimately that together, they also have, starting in 2002, maybe, the euro in most of those European states, that there is some stability, and it really increases trade, that you don't have to do conversions between currencies, which has some financial problems, more complicated matters. But essentially, no more tariffs, freedom of movement, and a unified currency, not by everyone, by others. But there are also Eurosceptic movements in the modern era that are questioning a lot of these conditions. Particularly in the United Kingdom was the most obvious case, where Brexit happened just a year ago. So this leads us really to modern Europe and the issues of today. The idea of European unification has been to prevent the first half of the century, the two world wars. And the idea is that integrated economies are interdependent and much less likely to go to war. Okay, so if you've watched the 4 videos by now, you now know all of European history for the last 571 years. So congratulations, and good luck on your exam.